The air in my shop always smelled of clean death, antiseptic, dried lavender, and the bitter metallic tang of blood-clotting agents. It was a sterile pocket in a city that reeked of rain and ozone, a city ruled by beings who hummed with contained lightning. I kept my head down. I mixed my poultices, ground my herbs, and sold my remedies to the human dregs who, like me, lived in the cracks of their glittering world. My hands worked on their own, grinding dried yarrow into a fine powder with the smooth, cool weight of a marble pestle. Mortar and pestle, my constants. The rhythmic scrape and crunch was the only sound, a meditative beat against the low hum of the city's power grid. My own pulse was a sluggish, tired counterpoint. My hair, a messy knot of dark brown, had fallen into my eyes, and I pushed it away with the back of a wrist, leaving a dusty green smudge on my skin. I didn't care. Utilitarian. That was my watchword. Utilitarian clothes, utilitarian work, a utilitarian existence. Anonymity was a cloak, and I wore it until it was threadbare. Outside, the light was the color of a day-old bruise, filtered through the perpetual gray clouds and the towering, crystalline architecture of the Ashwin elite. Here, inside, my world was contained to the scent of herbs and the comforting predictability of chemistry. The bell above my door didn't jingle. It was designed to be silent, but the shift in air pressure was a shout in the quiet space, a cold draft that raised the hairs on my arms. I didn't look up. Not right away. I finished tapping the yarrow powder onto a square of wax paper, my movements deliberately slow, even as my heart gave a painful, panicked lurch against my ribs. Then the sound. The precise, lethal click of heeled boots on my worn stone floor. 2 sets. They were immaculate, the sound of polished leather and absolute authority. My lungs tightened. I could smell the sharp, clean scent of their tailored coats and the faint, electric charge that clung to their kind. I finally forced myself to look. They were Wardens. Their platinum hair was a stark, silver-white slash against the gloom of my shop, their eyes the flat, uninterested gray of a winter sky. They moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and entirely predatory. The one on the left ran a gloved finger along a shelf of dried botanicals, leaving no smudge, his expression one of faint disgust. The one on the right stood by the door, a sentinel, his gaze sweeping over my humble workspace as if cataloging every possible threat. My threat level was 0. I was a professional at being 0. Routine inspection, the first one said. His voice was like stones grinding together, devoid of warmth. Step away from the counter, apothecary. My hands were shaking. I clasped them behind my back, hiding the tremor. I took a slow step back, the worn floorboards groaning under my weight. He moved forward, his movements economical, his eyes missing nothing. He didn't look at me, but I felt his awareness like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. He began to open drawers, his search methodical, contemptuous. The metallic clatter of my instruments sounded like a scream in the silence. I focused on my breathing. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. A simple calming technique that did absolutely nothing to slow the frantic drumming in my ears. He saw nothing of interest. Tinctures for coughs, salves for burns, the mundane ailments of a fragile species. He was about to turn away, bored. His elbow caught a tray of surgical steel. The tray tilted. Scalpels, forceps, and shears, all freshly sterilized, slid toward the edge in a silver cascade. A purely instinctual reaction, stupid and unthinking, made me lurch forward to catch it. My hand shot out. A razor-sharp scalpel, dislodged from the rest, spun through the air. I felt a sting, a searing, electric line of pain across my outer forearm. I hissed, pulling my arm back. The tray crashed to the floor. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't the noise that made them both freeze. It was the blood. A single, dark crimson line welled up on my skin. My blood, thick and startlingly red against the pallor of my arm. The warden who had knocked the tray over stared at it. His partner took a step forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the weapon at his side. The air grew thick, charged with sudden, sharp-edged suspicion. "What is this?" the first warden demanded, his voice dropping an octave. He took a step closer. He was faster. His gloved hand shot out and seized my wrist. His grip was like iron, cold and unforgiving. The pressure made a fresh bead of blood squeeze from the cut. He brought my arm closer to his face, his gaze analytical, cold. I could feel the frantic pulse in my throat, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. "Let go of me," I whispered, the words barely audible. He ignored me. With his other hand, he pulled off his glove, revealing long, pale fingers. A flicker of arrogance crossed his face. He was going to prove a point. Show me how unafraid he was of my pathetic human biology. He lowered his head, his focus entirely on the glistening crimson line. I felt a surge of pure, primal terror. A silent scream built in my chest, clawing at my throat. "Don't touch it." The thought was a physical force, a desperate, useless prayer. His index finger, deliberate and slow, reached out and touched the largest drop of my blood. The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a scream. It was a hiss, sharp and violent, like water hitting a hot skillet. A wisp of gray smoke curled up from the point of contact. The warden snatched his hand back, his eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning to horror. The tip of his finger was gone. Not burned, not bleeding. Simply erased. In its place, a soft, crumbling gray ash was already drifting to the floor. The horror on his face was absolute. It spread from his finger up his hand, a wave of disintegration that made no sound other than a faint, dry crackling. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His entire body convulsed. The gray ash cascaded from him, his impeccable uniform and the being within it collapsing into a heap of fine, dark dust on the stone floor. It settled with a soft whisper. The other warden stared, his face a mask of disbelief. The pile of ash that had been his partner smoked faintly, smelling of burnt sugar and ozone. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then his training took over. His face contorted with rage and fear. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He lunged, and the world became a blur of pain and noise. The back of my head hit the stone wall with a sickening crack. Stars exploded behind my eyes. Glass vials shattered as I was slammed into the shelves. The scent of a dozen different herbs filled the air, a chaotic, pungent perfume. His hands were on me, brutal and efficient. He dragged me from my shop, my boots scraping uselessly against the floor. The cold, damp air of the street was a shock. The gray light was blinding after the dimness of my shop. People stopped. They stared. The sight of a warden dragging a bloody human from an apothecary shop was a spectacle. Their faces were a blur of curiosity and fear. I was property being seized, a defective product being recalled. He hauled me down the street, his grip a vice on my upper arm. My feet stumbled on the uneven cobblestones. He was pulling me toward the district checkpoint, toward the sterile white plinth in the center of the square. The executioner's block. My mind refused to process it. This wasn't happening. It was a mistake. A nightmare. The cold air burned my lungs. My vision swam. I could feel the blood from my arm dripping down my fingers, leaving a trail of tiny, dark splashes on the pale stones. A death sentence written in my own veins. They forced me to my knees before the plinth. The stone was slick with rain and something else, something I refused to identify. Another figure in a severe black suit stepped forward. Linnea Blythe. Her platinum pixie cut was sharp as glass, her face utterly impassive. She held a rod of polished obsidian that hummed with contained energy. My end. My body trembled uncontrollably, a leaf in a storm. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the buzz of energy to cease, for the nothingness. Stop! The word was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd and the hum of the city like a shard of ice. It held an authority so absolute that even the air seemed to obey, growing still and heavy. Linnea Blythe froze, the obsidian rod inches from my neck. The warden holding me stiffened, his knuckles white. I opened my eyes. King Theron was walking toward us. He moved with a languid, predatory grace, the sea of onlookers parting before him as if by an unseen force. His suit was the color of a moonless night, tailored to perfection. His long, platinum hair drifted behind him like silk thread. But it was his eyes that held me captive. They weren't gray like the others. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with their own internal light. He didn't look at the wardens. He didn't look at the crowd. His amber gaze was fixed on me. As he drew closer, a scent washed over me, eclipsing the ozone and damp stone. It was sandalwood and something else, something ancient and intoxicating like rare spice and old leather. He stopped a few feet away, his head tilted. His nostrils flared just once. He was smelling me. Lord Garrick Vesper was suddenly at his side, his own buzz-platinum hair, making him look severe and dangerous. Your Majesty, this creature is a threat. It disintegrated a warden with a touch. Theren didn't even glance at him. He took another slow step forward, kneeling down in front of me, so we were eye to eye. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. He saw the cut on my arm, the blood that had now traced a path to my fingertips. He lifted a hand, and I flinched, but he didn't touch me. He simply gestured toward my arm. Slowly, as if in a trance, I lifted it. The wound was a stark, ugly line against my skin. He leaned in, his focus absolute. The world narrowed to the space between us, to his golden eyes and the scent of sandalwood and power. His face was inches from my arm. Then he did the unthinkable. His tongue, a surprising red against the pallor of his skin, darted out and touched the largest bead of blood on my forearm. A jolt, electric and terrifying, shot through me. I waited for the hiss, for the smoke, for him to crumble into dust. Nothing happened. He pulled back. A single, dark red smear was on his lips. His golden eyes flared, the color deepening to a burning ember. A slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of kindness. It was a smile of discovery, of hunger, of ownership. That smile, it unmade me. In the echoing silence of the great hall, surrounded by armored beings of pure energy and shadow, that smile was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It stripped away my defiance, peeled back my fear, and laid bare a primal horror I didn't know I possessed. The smear of my blood on his perfect lips was a brand, a claim. He had tasted the poison and found it to be wine. Lord Garrick Vesper took a sharp step forward, his voice a blade of ice. Majesty, the risk is too great. Let the executor handle it. Theren rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion, never taking his eyes off me. He licked the blood from his lips, a slow, deliberate act. His golden eyes burned brighter, pupils blown wide. He didn't speak. He simply lifted a hand, a gesture of dismissal aimed at Garrick, and the universe seemed to obey. The immense pressure in the hall lessened. The air, which had been thick with ozone and malice, thinned enough for me to draw a ragged breath. Two of the wardens, their forms less distinct than before, glided forward. They didn't touch me. Instead, they flanked me, their presence a cage of cold energy. Theren turned, his long black coat swirling around him like smoke. She is to be quartered in the East Wing. See to it, Linnea. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the throne, androgynous, with textured platinum hair cut close to the scalp, and a minimalist black suit that seemed to absorb the light. This was Linnea Blythe, the executor. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were devoid of all emotion as they landed on me. She gave a single, sharp nod. And Garrick, Theron's voice was soft now, almost a purr, but it carried a steel edge that made the hairs on my arm stand up again. Double the patrols on the outer wards. I sense instability in the city. He glanced back at me, just for a second, and that terrible, beautiful smile flickered again. We must protect our assets. I was no longer a person. I was an asset. Linnea led the way. My feet felt disconnected from my body as I walked, a phantom in my own skin. We moved through corridors of polished black basalt that reflected our passage like a dark mirror. There were no decorations, no paintings, no sign of life, only the cold, oppressive perfection of the architecture. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of Linnea's clothes and the soft, almost imperceptible hum of the wardens flanking me. The air grew warmer, losing its cavernous chill, and began to carry a scent. It was faint at first, then stronger. Dried herbs, beeswax, old paper. The smell of my shop. The smell of home. My heart hammered against my ribs, a panicked bird in a cage. Was this a trick? A psychological torment before my execution? Linnea stopped before a set of carved wooden doors, startlingly organic in this world of stone and shadow. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. I saw no lock, heard no click, but the doors swung inward silently. She gestured for me to enter. I stepped across the threshold and stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was my apothecary, not a replica, not an approximation. It was my shop, perfectly recreated down to the last detail. The worn wooden counter with its myriad of tiny scratches and potion stains. The shelves crammed with glass jars of herbs, tinctures, and powders, each label handwritten in my own messy scrawl. The mortar and pestle I'd inherited from my grandmother sat by the window, a sliver of dried nightshade still clinging to the stone. Even the air held the same comforting chaos of scents, lavender and clove, damp earth and chamomile. A cot, identical to my own, was tucked into the corner, the quilt frayed in the same familiar pattern. It was a perfect, beautiful violation. I turned to Linnea, my voice a broken whisper. "What is this?" Her gray eyes were unblinking. "Your new quarters. His Majesty believes a comfortable environment will be conducive to your cooperation." Cooperation with what? That is for him to discuss with you. She stepped back, and the wardens solidified their positions on either side of the doorway. You will be provided with meals. Any attempt to leave or to use your abilities on the guards will be met with immediate and permanent consequences. Do you understand? I couldn't speak. I just stared at the impossible room, this stolen piece of my life. I nodded, a small, jerky movement. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, and this time I heard the sound of a lock I couldn't see. A deep, final thud that echoed in the marrow of my bones. I was alone. I ran a trembling hand along the counter, the wood warm and real beneath my fingertips. I uncorked a jar of dried calendula and inhaled. The scent was real. It was all real. He hadn't just captured me. He had stolen my world and locked me inside it. I spent the first cycle. I couldn't tell day from night in this windowless prison, in a state of numb shock. I paced the floorboards, the familiar creak of the third board from the door, both a comfort and an agony. I cataloged my supplies. Everything was there, the poisons as well as the cures. The thought flickered through my mind, hot and fast. I could end. The second cycle brought food. A silent panel slid open in the wall, revealing a tray of food so exquisite it seemed obscene in my rustic prison. Roasted meats, delicate pastries, fruits I'd only read about in books. I ate, my stomach churning, because survival is an instinct that dies hard. It was on the third cycle that he came. There was no knock. The door simply opened. King Theron Ashwin stood there, silhouetted against the dark corridor. He had changed out of his formal coat and wore a simple black tunic and trousers, the fine material doing nothing to hide the lean strength of his frame. He looked less like a king and more like a predator at rest. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. The air in my small world instantly became charged, thick with his presence. He took in the room, his amber eyes lingering on the shelves of herbs, the drying racks, the general clutter of my life. "An interesting craft," he said, his voice a low resonance that vibrated through the floor. He picked up a small, tightly bound bundle of sage from my work table. He brought it to his nose, inhaling deeply, to coax power from the dirt, from weeds and flowers. I stood by the cot, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my body rigid with tension. "What do you want from me?" He set the sage down, his movements precise and unhurried. "I want to understand." He walked toward me, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. He stopped an arm's length away. The scent of him, that strange, intoxicating mix of spice and leather, filled my senses. My mind reeled. Peace, the very essence of my blood, the thing that had protected me my entire life, was a balm to him? "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, my voice shaking. "Don't you?" His eyes bored into mine, and I felt stripped bare. Every lie and half-truth flayed from me. "Your blood is an anomaly, a paradox, and I find myself deeply curious." He held out his hand, palm up. On it rested a small, wicked-looking silver lancet, its tip gleaming. "I wish to test a theory." I stared at the lancet, then back at his face. This was it, the demand. I had a choice: refuse and face whatever permanent consequences Linnea had promised, or comply and become a part of his experiment, a lab rat in a gilded cage. My hand trembled as I raised it. Slowly, I extended my index finger. He didn't take my hand. He watched, his expression unreadable, as I took the lancet from his palm. The silver was cold against my skin. I hesitated, the sharp point hovering over the pad of my finger. His gaze was a physical force compelling me. With a sharp intake of breath, I pricked my own skin. A single, perfect sphere of dark red blood welled up. He didn't move. He just watched the blood, his nostrils flaring slightly. The hunger was back in his eyes, a raw, primal thing that he barely kept leashed. He leaned in, his focus absolute. The world shrank to the space between us, the scent of him, the sight of my own blood on my fingertip. He lowered his head, and, just as he had in the throne room, he touched his tongue to the drop. This time, I was ready for the jolt. It shot up my arm, a current of heat and ice, but I didn't flinch. I watched him. I watched as he closed his eyes, a flicker of something crossing his features. His shoulders, which I hadn't realized were tense, relaxed. A subtle sigh escaped his lips. The sharp, predatory lines of his face seemed to soften. The oppressive aura of power that always surrounded him didn't vanish, but it gentled. It was like watching a storm cloud bleed away its lightning, leaving only the soft gray of rain. He opened his eyes. The gold was still there, but it was warmer, less like a burning coal and more like honey in the sun. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something beyond the king, beyond the ancient, powerful being. I saw a flicker of weariness, a deep, profound exhaustion that seemed to resonate from the very core of his soul. "Extraordinary," he whispered. And so it began. He came every few cycles. At first, it was always the same ritual. The silver lancet, the single drop of blood, the quiet transformation. He never took more. He would sit in the small wooden chair by my counter while I stood or perched on my cot, and he would watch me. Sometimes he would ask questions about my work. He'd pick up a jar of foxglove and ask its properties. I'd tell him it could stop a heart, or in the right doses, steady it. He seemed fascinated by the duality, the fine line between a cure and a poison. He never spoke of his world, of his politics, or his enemies. In my little room, he was not a king. He was just Theren, a being seeking a moment of respite. The change in him grew more noticeable with each visit. The effect lasted longer. He came to me once with a line of tension etched between his brows, his movements sharp and agitated. He had just come from a council meeting, I gathered. He performed the ritual, and the change was more dramatic than ever before. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes, and a genuine, unrestrained smile touched his lips. "Garrick believes I'm growing soft," he murmured, his voice lazy, almost slurred. "He thinks the human filth of the city is seeping through the wards, corrupting the Ethel." I said nothing, my heart pounding. Lord Garrick Vesper. I had not seen him since that first day, but his name was a cold stone in the pit of my stomach. "He doesn't understand," Theren continued, his eyes still closed. "This burden, to feel everything, every tremor of power, every shift in allegiance, every lie whispered 100 miles away. It is a constant screaming noise. It has been for centuries. He opened his eyes and looked at me, his gaze hazy and unfocused. But this, he was addicted, not to the blood itself, but to what it did to him. It wasn't a physical craving, but a psychological one, an addiction to silence, an addiction to the fleeting, blissful ignorance of being human. As the weeks bled into one another, our routine shifted. He began to stay longer after taking the drop. The silence between us became less tense, more companionable. One time, he found me grinding herbs, and he sat and watched my hands work the pestle for nearly an hour, his expression placid. The lines of kingship, of centuries of burden, were smooth from his face. He looked younger. He looked vulnerable. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Linnea was my only other point of contact with the outside world. She would bring my meals, her gray eyes always assessing, always cataloging. She never spoke of the king's visits, but I knew she was aware of them. She was the executor. It was her job to be aware of everything. Her silent observation was a constant pressure, a reminder that my gilded cage was still a cage, and my life was not my own. The whispers started to reach me, faint echoes through the stone. Guards speaking in hushed tones when they thought I was asleep. They spoke of the king's strange moods, his newfound leniency, a death sentence commuted to exile, a trade dispute settled with a compromise that favored the human merchants. Lord Vesper, they said, was furious. The court was unsettled. The king was changing. My blood was the catalyst. I was a drug, and Theren Ashwind was becoming a willing addict. I held a strange, precarious power. I was his weakness. And in this court of ancient, powerful predators, a weakness was a death sentence. For both of us, one evening, or what passed for it in my timeless prison, he came to me in a state I had never seen before. He was vibrating with a barely suppressed rage. His golden eyes were chips of flint, and the air around him crackled. He didn't even speak. He strode across the room, took my hand, his grip like iron, and pressed a lancet into my palm. "More," he said, his voice a raw command. I didn't argue. I made a deeper cut than usual, this time across the fleshy part of my palm. Blood welled, dark and thick. He didn't lick it. He lowered his mouth to my hand and drank. The sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't just a jolt this time, it was a torrent. I felt his rage, his frustration, his crushing weariness, and I felt it all drain away, replaced by the quiet warmth of my own essence flowing into him. He drank for a long time, and I felt myself grow lightheaded. When he finally pulled away, his lips were stained red. His eyes were unfocused, glazed over with a profound peace. He stumbled back, leaning against the counter for support. A low, soft chuckle escaped his lips. It was a sound so utterly out of place, so foreign, that it sent a shiver down my spine. "He wants to purge the lower city," Theren mumbled, his words thick. "Garrick, he says the human influence is a disease, wants to cleanse it with fire." He shook his head slowly, a dreamy smile on his face. Too loud, always so loud. He slid down the wall to sit on the floor, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He looked up at me, his gaze soft and unfocused. He seemed completely undone, his royal authority dissolved into a puddle of narcotic tranquility. He patted the floor beside him. "Sit, Ondine." Hesitantly, I sank to the floor, my back against the shelves of herbs, facing him. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of our breathing. He reached out, his movements slow and clumsy, and his fingers brushed against the back of my hand. There was no fire, no shock of power, just the warm, slightly callous touch of his skin against mine. It was the most normal, most human gesture I had ever received from him. He was high, dangerously so. His guard was not just down, it was gone. He rested his head back against the wooden shelves, his eyes fluttering closed. The king of the Ethel, the ancient, powerful ruler of this shadow kingdom, was asleep on the floor of my prison, intoxicated by my blood. A profound sense of dread. My head snapped toward the door. It was open, a dark slice in the wall. And standing in the doorway, his face a mask of stone, was Lord Garrick Vesper. His short platinum hair seemed to bristle with contained fury. His eyes, cold and sharp as splintered ice, took in the scene in an instant. They flickered from Theron's slumped, vulnerable form on the floor to my wide, terrified eyes. He saw the smear of blood around Theron's mouth. He saw the open wound on my palm. Understanding, cold and absolute, dawned on his severe features. It was followed by a wave of triumphant, murderous rage. He stepped silently into the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound was small, metallic. Final. A single click that sealed the world outside and left me inside with the predator and his would-be usurper. My breath snagged in my throat, a painful, useless thing. Garrick Vesper took another step, his polished shoes making no sound on the stone floor. He moved with the chilling grace of a patient wolf, one that knows its prey is already cornered and bleeding. His gaze was a physical weight, pinning me in place. He wasn't looking at me as a person. I was a component, a piece of evidence in the treason he was about to punish, a means to an end. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, slid from my face back to Theren, who was stirring now, a low groan vibrating in his chest. Theron's head lolled to the side, his platinum hair falling across his face like a silken shroud. His eyelids fluttered, the golden glow of his irises dimmed, unfocused, clouded by the potent humanity of my blood. So, Garrick's voice was low, a rasp of stone on stone. It was steeped in a satisfaction so pure it was almost reverent. The legends were true after all. Our king, the unbreachable fortress, brought to his knees by a mortal container. He took another silent step, circling us, his presence sucking the warmth from the air. For centuries, we have thrived on discipline, on control. We culled the weak, we purged the sentimental. We built an empire on the foundation of our superiority, our detachment. He stopped, positioning himself between us and the door. The only way out. And you, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a blade of ice against my skin. You would throw it all away for this fleeting warmth, this pathetic imitation of life. Theren pushed himself up on one elbow. The movement was slow, labored. A tremor ran through his arm. He looked mortal, breakable. His amber eyes, still hazy, found Garrick. Vesper, he breathed, his voice rough and used. You overstep. A dry, humorless laugh escaped Garrick's lips. I overstep? No, my king. You have fallen, and a fall from such a height. He let the sentence hang in the frigid air. It is my duty to our people, to the very legacy you created, to end it. I saw the shift in his posture, the subtle coiling of muscle beneath his perfect suit. He was going to kill him. Right here, while he was weak, confused, still drowning in the unfamiliar sensations I had unleashed in his veins. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. This was it. This was the coup. Not with armies and proclamations, but here, in the dark, with a witness who was meant to be the first casualty of the new regime. Theren tried to rise further, to get his feet under him, but his coordination was gone. He was like a newborn colt, all graceless limbs and shuddering weakness. Garrick watched him with a look of profound disgust, the look one might give a diseased animal. My mind raced, a chaotic storm of fear and calculation. If Theren died, Garrick would not let me live. I was the proof of Theron's weakness, a loose end he could not afford. My only chance was Theren, a weak, drugged, helpless Theren. It was no chance at all. He made us gods, Garrick continued, his voice resonating with zealous fury. And he has forgotten what that means. He seeks to grovel in the mud with humanity, to feel. I will remind him of his own laws. With a speed that blurred the eye, Garrick moved. He didn't lunge. He simply crossed the space between them as if the air itself had folded. The sound of his fist connecting with Theron's jaw was a sharp, wet crack. Theron's head snapped back, and he collapsed onto the floor, a full-body shudder racking his frame. He didn't cry out. He just lay there, the golden light in his eyes flickering like a dying candle. Something inside me broke. It wasn't logic. It wasn't a plan. It was a primal, gut-wrenching instinct. Watching this immense, terrifying power I had come to know reduced to something so fragile, so victimized. It was wrong. It was a violation of the natural order I had only just begun to understand. Garrick stood over him, raising a hand. I could feel the power gathering around him, a palpable drop in temperature, the air growing thin and sharp. He was preparing a final, lethal strike. My choice was not a choice. It was a reflex. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, the rough stones scraping my skin. My own blood, still sluggishly welling from the cut on my palm, smeared across the floor. "No," I whispered, the words swallowed by the oppressive silence. Garrick glanced at me, a flicker of annoyance in his icy gaze. A fly buzzing at an execution. He dismissed me, turning his attention back to the fallen king. That was his mistake. With a surge of adrenaline that set my teeth on edge, I launched myself across the remaining distance. I didn't try to fight Garrick. I threw myself over Theren, a pathetic human shield. My bleeding hand, slick and warm, landed on his chest. His own hand, cold as marble, twitched beneath it. His gaze, hazy and lost, found mine. There was confusion there, and pain, but something else too. A question. He was too weak to drink, too disoriented. I pushed myself up, ignoring the towering threat of Garrick behind me. I brought my palm to Theron's lips. The smear of my blood was already on his mouth, but this was different. This was a conscious offering, a desperate sacrament. "Drink," I commanded, my voice shaking but fierce. "Theren, drink." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. His lips were cold, unresponsive. Garrick scoffed behind me, a sound of contemptuous pity. He raised his hand again, and then I felt it. The faintest pressure, the tentative touch of his tongue against the open wound. It was not the hungry, desperate pull from before. It was a slow, deliberate act, a conscious acceptance. The world did not explode. It imploded. The change began not with a sound, but with a feeling. A deep, resonant hum that started in the floor beneath me and vibrated up through my bones. It was the sound of a great machine stirring to life. The air didn't just chill, it froze. Crystalline frost, intricate as lace, spread out from Theron's body in a perfect, silent circle, racing across the stone. It climbed the walls. It glazed the wooden shelves, encasing my herbs and powders in shimmering ice. My breath plumed in front of my face, a cloud of white in the suddenly arctic air. I pulled my hand back, a gasp of pain and shock escaping me. Where my blood had touched his lips, a faint, golden light was glowing, seeping into him. Theron's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the dim, hazy amber of a moment ago. They were molten gold. Garrick took an involuntary step back, his mask of triumphant rage cracking to reveal the first glint of primal fear. The power rolling off Theren was different. It was denser, heavier. It was imbued with something vital, something alive. Ew. Theron's voice was no longer human. It was the grinding of tectonic plates, the roar of a distant supernova. It was a sound that promised utter annihilation. You would touch what is mine. He didn't move in a blur. He simply ceased to be in one place and appeared in another. He was in front of Garrick, his hand clamped around the other man's throat. Garrick's eyes bulged. He struggled, his own formidable power flaring and sputtering against Theron's like a match in a hurricane. It was useless. Theren leaned in close, his lips near Garrick's ear. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the understanding dawn in Garrick's eyes, followed by a wave of pure, abject terror. There was no snap, no violence. Garrick simply stilled, the light in his eyes extinguished. His body went limp, and Theren released him. Lord Garrick Vesper crumpled to the floor, a perfectly tailored suit filled with nothing but dust and ice, which sublimated into a fine, gray mist that settled on the frozen floor. Silence. The profound, ringing silence that follows an apocalypse. Slowly, the intense cold began to recede. The frost on the walls wept, turning to glistening beads of water. The hum faded, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Theren stood over the remains of his rival, his back to me. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep, controlled breath. When he finally turned, the inferno in his eyes had banked, leaving the familiar molten gold, but they held a new depth, a new intensity. He looked at me, on my bleeding hand, on my terrified face. The door creaked open. Linnea Blythe stood there, her pixie hair and minimalist suit a stark contrast to the chaos. Her face was impassive, but her eyes took in the scene. The dissipating mist that was once Garrick, the frozen circle on the floor, me huddled on my knees. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to Theren. A question and an affirmation. The coup was over before it had ever truly begun. She stepped back, pulling the door quietly shut, leaving us alone once more. Theren crossed the room to me. He didn't command me to rise. He knelt, his movements still imbued with that terrifying grace. He took my injured hand, his fingers surprisingly gentle. He examined the cut, his thumb brushing away a smear of drying blood. He was right, Theren said, his voice quiet now, regaining its human timbre. I had forgotten. He looked up, his gaze locking with mine. There was no anger, no coldness. There was only a profound, shattering awe. He placed my palm flat against the front of his suit, against his chest. At first, I felt nothing, just the fine wool of his jacket and the solid muscle beneath. And then, I felt it, faint at first, then stronger. A steady, rhythmic, powerful thump. Thump, thump. It was a heartbeat, a real, living, human heartbeat, drumming a steady, relentless rhythm inside the chest of an immortal king. For 1,000 years, he whispered, his golden eyes searching mine, holding me. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the warmth of my skin against his chest, the impossible, steady beat beneath my palm. It was the most terrifying and beautiful sound I had ever heard. The echo of a life he had never known, now thrumming with the power of my own. We were no longer king and apothecary. We were something new, something far more dangerous. And as I knelt there on the cold stone floor, with the ghost of ice in the air and the impossible rhythm of his heart beating against my hand, I knew there was no going back.